couple of weeks ago, after a short illness, I lost my mum. Her final hours were very difficult indeed, and when death finally came, we saw this as a blessing. Even so, we all miss her immensely. We've had the funeral, which was small, intimate, and very nice. But I would like there to be a permanent memorial for her, which doesn't require stumbling across a gravestone in a sprawling cemetery. And having this platform seems like the perfect opportunity. So what follows is a reading of the eulogy I wrote in her memory and read out at the funeral. Thank you for taking the time to listen and for any kind comments that you make. Anyone who had ever met Mum would know that she was kind, caring, and always willing to lend a hand. From her experiences working as a soldier, or a cleaner, or as a security officer, she was never afraid to get stuck in and to get her hands dirty. She was often a woman in a man's world, at a time when this was far less fashionable than it is today, and she could give as good as she got. She was never afraid to stand up and to say what was needed to be said. In later years, she lost much of that confidence, which I know was really frustrating and often quite scary for her. She was always available to support her children. Back in 2010, I was the victim of a targeted armed raid. Despite being bound, gagged, and barricaded, I managed to keep my head throughout, which directly led to the perpetrators getting a combined 8 years in prison. I was subsequently invited to receive an award from the county's High Sheriff, and it was Mum who was there to support me all the way. I later presented her with the framed award, which she then proudly displayed above the fireplace in her living room. Whilst she was naturally a loner, she always had friends. But in recent times, her very best friends were the little feathered visitors to her back garden. She loved to keep the feeders full and would regularly top up the little water fountains so they would always have somewhere to drink. She would watch and track the birds as they went to and fro and would love to share stories from the bird table. They brought her so much joy, especially the little ones. Of course, birds weren't the only animals that she loved. When we first moved to the town, she took a trip up to Battersea and adopted a dog. Mindy was a scamp, the runt of her litter, completely dappy and totally amazing. We lost her decades ago, but Mum has displayed her photos right up until the end. She'd also sponsored a couple of dogs from the Dogs Trust and took great pleasure in keeping us updated on the newsletters of Bo and Lollipop's progress. Oh, and as a dairy farmer's daughter, I guess deep down she'll always be associated with cows. Whilst an animal lover, she didn't love all animals equally. I remember the story of her riding home on a pushbike at dusk through the dimly lit country lanes of the Weald. She was probably a young teen at the time, wearing some kind of strappy top. Anyway, something dark, warm, and very much alive instantly appeared from out of nowhere and attached itself onto her chest. Mum was in panic and pedalled for all of her life to get home for help. It didn't take her parents long to remove the bat from her chest and ushered it back into the night. But if you really wanted to rattle Mum with an animal, simply give her the gift of a frog, or a lizard, or a snake. Even the hint of any of these three creatures would send her over the edge. Mum was of the old school and was very nervous of new technology. About 15 years ago, it was with much kicking and screaming that I presented her with her very first laptop and Facebook, with the reassurance of, That's just the way people stay in touch these days, Mum. I don't want people to know my business, she would say. 15 years later, and she would regularly share updates, wry comments, and gossip, including her infamous weekly Saturday giggle. Whilst I don't think she ever truly understood the difference between hard drive storage and Facebook content, I mean, it does all appear on the same screen, there were times, to my pleasant surprise, that she'd successfully upload pictures taken on her digital camera. Now, sure, many may have been more than just a little bit out of focus, but she did it. And I am so proud of her for doing so. One of my favourite recent memories came at Christmas, where I introduced her to virtual reality. After a few tentative early steps and trying to comfortably fit the headset over her face, she suddenly found her mojo, wielding a pistol and shooting both stationary and moving targets with aplomb. I guess you can take the girl out of the army, but you cannot take the army out of the girl. But while these memories bring me joy, that's mostly because she was bending over to encompass something from my world. Mum was not tech. Mum was back-to-back black and white movies during the day. The twinkle in her eye for Paul Michael Glaser or Dennis Waterman, or especially Clint Eastwood. Mum was the music of the Beatles. Watching Formula One on the TV. The Horse Trials or Most Haunted. Emmerdale, EastEnders, Coronation Street. Falling asleep listening to her beloved Paul Miller on BBC local radio, and to my greatest surprise, after all those years that she actively hated football, listening to the live Brighton and Hove Albion football commentaries on that very same station. Other than blood and a shared history, we didn't actually have too much in common with each other, but we did have one thing. A shared spirituality. Over the course of her life, Mum had experienced many, many ghosts. From a figure at the end of her bed as a teenager, a horseman galloping through her camp whilst in the army, and recently the spirit of the assumed Mr. Dean in our family home. You would expect that being personally sceptical of God's existence would make all of this easy for me to laugh off. But I too have experienced things in that house that I do not have an explanation for, as have others. Are these forgotten souls lost on the way to a better place, or some kind of biochemical energy which ripples through our universe? Maybe one day we will know. Maybe not. The one thing I am certain of is that her love for a family is strong. And so, be it with wings on a cloud, or in some other yet undiscovered way, she is definitely here, watching us now, with all the love that a mother can muster. Mum, my mumsy, lives on. In our memories, in spirit, and in our hearts. Thank you for all you've given us. You will never be forgotten.